Good evening. This is our last lecture for this semester. And as you can see, the poster again. So before I introduce Peter, our guest, I'd like to just remind you this is the 75th anniversary of our program of architecture at Hong Kong U. So here, unfortunately, I have to read something because I don't want to forget some of the important points I'd like to make. So Sir Peter Cook, the visionary architect and educator, needs no introduction. We all know that since the 1960s, he has permanently changed the course of architecture, mainly through drawing and teaching. If you want to learn more about Peter's drawings, please go to M+ and dig into the Archigram treasure trove there. If you are interested in finding out further Peter's long teaching career, including 25 years at AA, please go online and check out the whole generation of architects who have inspired all of us, including Ram Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, Bernard Shumi, and so on. The list goes on. And now came out that same school in Bedford Square in London in the 70s and 80s. Yesterday at M+, I told the audience that one of my teachers, Rodney Place, he studied and taught at AA during Peter's era, who taught me so that it makes me a grand student of Peter's. So we have a generation gap in the middle. While we are familiar with Peter's achievements, what continues to intrigue, fascinate, puzzle, and haunt us is how he got here. I'm not sure the conventional combination of ambition plus hard work alone did the trick. I suspect that Peter, as well as his Archigram comrades, has been unleashing a particular kind of imagination, wild but real, and surreal from time to time, but never far from building, never abstract, never elitist, rather demonstrating a deep interest in pop culture instead of French post-structural philosophy. One can witness it in the project such as Instant City with balloons flying in and out, or Walking City with buildings marching on foot, etc. And a particular kind of a passion as well, not too serious, but serious at the same time, about city, event, mobility, technology, among other pressing concerns of the time. Playfulness or freedom seems to be essential to Peter's work. In my mind, Archigram shared a kindred spirit with the Beatles. I don't know if you agree, but who came up with who Beatles came up with designs like the Strawberry Fields and Yellow Submarine, etc. May I suggest that Archigram is the Beatles of architecture, or Beatles, the Archigram of music. For our students, please don't look for answers from Peter, but get ready to be taken away by him onto a journey that might lead to surprise and discoveries, which may include the ones of your own. Please join me to welcome Sir Peter Cook to the podium.
Lovely intro. I'm going to use a seat because I'm old. Right. Oh, yeah, this is not the first time I've lectured in this room. The room doesn't seem to have changed at all, but I have no doubt that under Yung Ho, it'll change. So I'm going to not really talk that much about Archigram. I will pass past it. And I spent this morning for about an hour or two looking at the archives. I hope this will be passed through. I don't think the way that they've been hung on the wall is very interesting. And I know that they've got more interesting stuff somewhere in portfolios and boxes. We do quite a lot of exhibitions right now, and I would personally rehang it. And I do urge you to hustle the people over there in M+, lovely though they are, to get some more stuff out and to cheer up the exhibition. It's a bit dead and a bit grotty, and it's not, I'm sorry. They should hire us to do a redo of the show. And I hope that's passed through to them, because it's important. Now, this is the trigger, yeah? This is yes. So I'm going to give you a sort of quick rundown on who and what I am, in a sense. This is me doing the plug-in city, of which the original drawing is in the archive, and a model of a thing called the Montreal Tower, which was done actually as an employee of a big building contractor called Taylor Woodrow, who employed all of us at one time, and we became the Archigram Group. They paid me to do this tower, which of course was never built. And Dennis Crompton, my fellow archigrammer, made the model. And it sits in another collection in Frankfurt, Germany. And on the right is me demonstrating the idea of what I call the infogonks. The idea, and you have to put it back into sort of the period of the 60s, or maybe beginning of the 70s, that you have all the audiovisual apparatus of a university in a pair of glasses. Probably would have driven you blind, but nonetheless, it was and of course the wire hanging down is just a piece of wire. It's not actually connected into anything, though in theory it would have been connected into something not dissimilar from this in your pocket. So in some ways, it was looking ahead. And that's me in my black hair period. Oops. Oh, got it. Oh, no, it's one of those. Okay. Somewhat later, I became very interested in the metamorphosis of projects or buildings that went from one thing to another. The drawing on the right, this was done in the 80s, and the drawing on the right is one of a series of drawings made for an exhibition where the organizer, the late Kristin Fire-Ice, who ran 80s Gallery, she suddenly and had given us some shows in the gallery. She was walking along in Berlin one day and she said, "I'm planning this really big exhibition, and everybody who takes part in it must do a project related to Berlin." I said, "That's interesting, yes." She said, "I want you to be in it." I said, "Yes." She said, "Zaha's going to be in it, Tom Main's going to be in it, Danny Liebskin's going to be in it." And I thought, "Huh? Okay, hold it, guys." And I said, "Yes." And then she went round a side street, and I thought, bloody hell. And I sort of spent about 6 months on this. It wasn't a competition, but it was hot company. And I took a piece of territory that I knew very well, which is the Kurfürstendamm in what was then still just West Berlin before it was united. And I did a crazy project which showed how strange things will transform. And this is a little detail piece. And if you look on the right-hand side of the right-hand drawing, there's a sort of thing that looks a bit like a cactus. And in fact, in the sequence of drawings, the cactus actually overtakes the more circumspect pieces of the project. Up into the 70s, then on the left with a former colleague, Christine Hawley, we were invited to do a pavilion in Osaka. And this was a pavilion that lasted for about a year, and you walked in and went through an experience of being sort of covered by water, but you were never made wet. And it was all supposed to be vaguely symbolic, and the wand on the right would move as the water moved, and so on and so forth. And in a funny way, it was a sort of conscious acknowledgement of Japan, because it did one of the things that the Japanese do, which is to sometimes, for example, no theatre, you have these people who come on wearing black. And I once asked my companion, I said, what are these guys in black? And he said, not there. I said, no, they were there. There were 5 of them. They were wearing black. He said, conceptually, not there. And this notion of black, of things that you recognize as having significance and not having significance, was quite an interesting thing. The guy was Izazaki, by the way, just to name drop. Now, this is a funny trigger. Yes. And then came later, in the end, towards 2000, with another colleague with whom I did lots of things, Colin Fournier, we made a competition for this building in Graz, the Kunsthaus, and we won the competition, amazingly. I think we had a good jury, a jury that probably liked us, and it was an open competition. And we had to build it very quickly. We had to build it within 2 years and on budget. And in fact, for an arts building, bearing in mind this is a slightly Looney Tunes looking arts building, we had to be in on budget and on time. We were 2% over budget and 2 months over time, which I think for an arts building is about more half of the course. And it sits in Graz, which is a very interesting city. I haven't got time to go into it, but it's a city which can absorb strange building, because ours is not the only strange building in town. And it sits like a sort of a dog in a basket within the town, and has become its symbol. The newspaper at the time did a survey when the project was published, and 70% people said, we don't want this thing in town. When it was finished, 70% in the same newspaper said, we love this building. And it then appeared on chocolate bars and toasters and things, etc. What would be now called merch. And of course, it was already using computers. Colin and I would sit in the corner of we were both professors at the Bartlett by this time. We would sit in a corner room, and 3 or 4 people who worked with us would come and watch while we scribbled and drew. And then they would take it home and digitalize it overnight and bring it back the next day. And then we would scribble and push and pull and push and pull, and then bring it back again. Then there was some absolutely manic computer geeks sitting in Graz. And I'm going to digress a bit, but it's very interesting when you build in a city, having built in a few places, when you build in a city like Graz, you have the advantage that there is a very old iron smelting tradition in that particular area. There's a great woodworking tradition. I think areas like that around Graz, and perhaps the area around Stuttgart, for example, are very good, because you though you are trying to do something that is, quote unquote modern, there is this local tradition of crafting, and that enables things to be invented. And a lot of local sort of inventive types gathered around our office and helped us manipulate this slightly eccentric building. I think another point that I often make about Graz is that, and I was making this point, I think, last night or maybe the night before, that around the AA, and this is back to Yo Hung's point, around the AA were all these people making drawings. And there was a conversation once with Rem Koolhaas, who at the time lived up the street from me. And we were stopping outside the dry cleaners or something, and we were saying, remember all those people at there who we were all condemned as drawers, artistes. We wouldn't really be competent because, we just did these drawings and then gradually, and we listed all the people we could think of, and gradually all of them had started making buildings, and their buildings didn't leak any more than anybody else's buildings. And then we said, what do they say now? Because it was very convenient for the great unwashed mainstream to pigeonhole us and say they're not really involved in the game. There's some other kind of animal. And then actually we come out of the pigeonholes and start making buildings here and there. Then what do they say? And I think that for me, it was very important that the Graz building, which is not exactly an Archigram building, but can in some senses be discussed as such, that it raised the question, maybe some of those other things could have been built. And of course, another about this slide is quite a joke, because we had to spend a lot of money, I mean, millions of euros, in order to preserve the building in the front, the old building, which is the earliest cast iron building in southern Austria, as part of the tradition of the area. But the joke was it was brought in from Sheffield in components. And we laughed like drains when we knew this, because okay, there were some English loonies that did some metal stuff and sold it to the Austrians 100 years before. And then there's some more English loonies that came and sold the Austrians some more metal and some plastic. I mean, I'm not being trite here. I think it makes you think twice about the notion of context. And I'm very cynical about context. This trigger is weird. And there's my lady wife in the front there, and something that I built this year, which is the pavilion, the play pavilion in the center of in the park in the center of London, and there is a village suggesting that this could be a prototype of a rather curious village, and the pavilion is now deconstructed and waiting in a warehouse for somebody to buy it. So if there's somebody wealthy in Hong Kong, if they got, I think they sell them for about a third of the price that it cost to build it originally. So it's a bargain. And this is where I work. The room on the left is a corner of where I work at the weekends, and where I live. And there's son's. Originally, it was my son's room. By the way, my son is more famous than me. For those of you who know the name A.G. Cook in the pop world, you'll know who I mean. And he used to make his first recordings in this room. And the animal collection is still there. And one of the drawings, the drawing below the animals, is actually a copy of one that's sitting in M+. And I was trying to persuade them to put that up on the wall rather than what they had put up on the wall, because it's much jollier and much nicer. And then the right-hand side, about 14 minutes walk from where I live, is a studio. I thought it might be interesting to you also to know what is my own taste in other people's architecture. And I can report that, I think the best building of the 20th century that I've ever seen is Clorindo Testa's Bank of London, South America. Now it's called something else. It's an extraordinary building, which I remember seeing as a sort of second-year student in a tiny photograph in a magazine. And even at that point, I said, what the hell is that? Wow. Never thinking I would ever get to go as far as Argentina. In fact, I've seen the building now 5 times and taken friends with it, and everybody's always wowed with it. It's an extraordinary building, which I haven't got time to go into, but I recommend you to. There is a big GA special on it, so it's accessible. Top right, and we were with him only 2 nights ago, is Wolf Prick's and Helmut Straczynski's building on the top of, it's actually an office for a lawyer, would you believe? And it sits on the roofscape on the corner of the First District. And it's I think it took them 500 drawings to produce this. And the job architect nearly went mad, was literally nearly went mad. Bottom right is an extraordinary building done by a recluse architect who I only managed to meet once, called Ludwig Leo. He was a contemporary with Matthias Ungers and such people. And it's called the Umlauf tank. It's a hydraulics laboratory, testing laboratory. And I used to be, as a student and later, great fan of Chernikov. And Chernikov's 101 fantasy book was something I would go specially in the A library to look at. And then I just sort of got used to that in the distance. And then, 10 or 15 years later, suddenly saw this. I thought, Chernikov lives. Such things are possible. And I can't resist it. I can't resist it. And of course, a bubble building. If I've done the bubble building, an English guy in the middle of the 19th century was doing a bubble building. That is to say, the Palm House in Kew, which I still think is one of the most beautiful of all of the glass houses. So architecture is firmness, commodity, and delight. But my use of the word piquancy is particular, because I think that when you have a piquant taste experience or atmospheric experience, it's more than just agreeable. It has overtones of indulgence. It has overtones of a delicious, extreme deliciousness, but also overtones of a subtlety that is not a full in your face. And I thought this is a quality that perhaps in several directions I have been searching for all along. Well, dreams of the 3D city, I come to your city here, in fact, just down the street, because the notion of the three-dimensional city has been with me for right from Archigram times. And you have this extraordinary system of escalators that crosses the striations of different streets, each of its own character and nuance, and it cuts across these nuances. And of course, there's the one in Barcelona, which moves goes in the direction of the Park Güell. And if we look at a drawing that they don't seem to have in M+, which is the cross-section of the plug-in city, you can see that I was even then preoccupied by diagonal connection between levels, and not just the structure being a diagonal system, tubes, but the more gradual diagonals of escalators and travelators. And I was delighted when I did get a decent-sized building to do, which was in Graz. I used the travelator as the means of connection, which is a lovely, slow-moving, gliding thing, that it's not a jerky thing or enclosed thing like a lift. It's a gliding thing. And the risk again of name dropping, I can say that I was delighted to be on the opening day, doing small talk with the Chancellor of Austria. We had a glass of Austrian white wine in our hands, and we glided up a travelator. And I thought the combination of this sort of Austrian politeness on the one hand, and just an ordinary old thing, what you get in a railway station, was making the point I wanted it to make. And this drawing has its own history, because I was appointed as the deputy to the fifth-year master at the AA. And this is normally a very humble, you're the dog's body of the chief guy. But I had this thing, I'd had the Plug-in City, the earlier Plug-in City, published in a very popular newspaper that was read at the time by 2 million people. And I realized that the students sitting there were introduced to this guy who was this deputy. But I did not have the advantage of the humility of that thing, because they all thought, God help us, we're going to be taught by this loony. And that was interesting. And my boss had a nervous breakdown. Suddenly I was in charge of 85 of the most arrogant, picky, opinionated, informed students that you could find anywhere. And it was baptism by fire. I was exhausted. I would work until well into the evening every day, usually dealing with psychological problems. I mean, I realized that most of teaching was actually to do with being a kind of armchair psychologist and mopping up and kind of reassuring, and then occasionally telling them where to put the staircase. But really the form of, and I was shattered. I was just did no drawing for 10 months until the summer came. And in the summer, I sat, I think, in a room that was given to me in the A, and I just did this drawing. And what was interesting is that perhaps all these puzzles and, dealing through other people's architectural knowledge or psychology had coagulated into a much more refined version of the plug-in city. Somehow it had worked. I don't recommend this as a procedure, but it's an interesting one if I look back upon it. And that's why I spent a little bit of time explaining it rather than telling you where, what each piece is. You can read that up in books. And so the idea of the three-dimensional city and the gliding of the diagonal of escalators and travelators and ramps has appealed to me right from when I was a student. And working on this dreaded project called Neom in the desert, which probably will never really happen. This is a preliminary drawing that I did, working on again the idea of diagonal movement and wrapping a certain kind of sub-architecture around the diagonal conditions. And then in the models and renditions that we made, this aspects of this notion of the three-dimensional city obviously move forward. And more recently, a kind of collage, not exactly a collage, but it's a mental collage of urban types, some of them quite recherché in a way, is again looking at the notion of the compounded three-dimensional city. Or here, in a drawing that I made about 3 or 4 years ago, which has proved very popular for people who buy prints. I look again at the megastructure in a more refined way, perhaps, and the notion of ground as not really existing, but as existing a series of soft territories. And the capsule has now metamorphosed into a kind of slightly floating, slightly hanging tent-like object, but still a three-dimensional city. And in this project, the three-dimensional city was that the yellow slabs of 2 or 3 story pieces of building had interventions of air, much more than an MVRDV building, really large, almost more air than buildings, so that the whole thing was breathing into three-dimensional space. And then sometimes cartoons about the horrific nature of the city. And sometimes notions, a more recent drawing, of a megastructure which sits upon the water, becomes a series of contained elements, and then becomes a vegetation at the top, a sort of a single organism in a sense. And a very, very recent drawing, which I call Fruity City, where the surface then is not just a series of prefabricated components of like kind, but a very wide variety of shall we say, provocative prefabricated components. And I have a couple of guys in the studio at the moment digitalizing this, and I've drawn some plans of it so that we can, I hope by my next exhibition, we'll be able to show how you walk around it. I'm interested in things that are not seen full frontally. I'm interested in mystery. I'm interested in so much architecture, it sort of comes in your face. There it is. That's what it is. Thank you very much. I'm interested in things that reveal themselves, and perhaps one has to work at the notion of the veil. That all is not what it seems. You give hints, but you don't show the whole story. And that within, in this particular case, you can see, if you look carefully, that there is the shadow of an actual solid building sitting behind the veil. And in this particular case, pieces of that are allowed to percolate through the veil. It's not a completely veil. There's certain hints. They're like pimples that come through the veiling. Or here where the veils, there's only a loosely tectonic arrangement. There's a bit of a ramp and people walking on it, but then the whole space is, and again, the whole spaces are littered with kind of almost fan-like conditions. And then another retake on the idea of the extended capsule. The capsule in this condition is a more fruity object. I've come back and forth over the and a very recent drawing, which is I'm a seaside person originally, and I was interested in, as it were, impregnating the beach with facilities for health devices of balm and scent and water, and that there are these floating drones that descend over the beach. And here a series of veils incorporated with the buildings themselves. And the most recent drawing of all is an interior as part of the fruity city. Again, this is going to be modeled and with a bit of AI being used. But I do the hand drawing first. This is a little detail of the pavilion, play pavilion, where one plays a little bit again with this idea of veiling, that when you saw it at a distance, you saw some interesting things happening inside, but you couldn't quite see what they were, quite deliberately. And then it is gradually revealed as you enter it. Sometimes in a more circumspect competition project, the veiling is a complete mask, except that you reveal slithers at the bottom of each room by the floor, and at the top in the corners. You almost articulate the interior by hints. And at night, people's feet would be seen walking backwards and forwards inside. I'm not used to this particular trigger. Okay. Another thing that interests me a lot is the piquancy of isolated objects. This particular picture is taken from Starhead in Wiltshire, which is a beautiful, enormous garden and has these pre-selected little temples and decoys amongst it. And I say the temptation of the pavilion in the trees, once you set up this idyllic condition and then you suddenly tempt with something that is a delight. And I've done, again, a pavilion, not in anything like such a big park. It's on a campus in Bournemouth, where I originally studied before I went to the AA. I use that same device of the low-level window by which you can see the feet moving inside, but you don't distract the people inside. And from within, you see the pine trees, which are characteristic of that particular town, but it's tilted so that you are not distracted by the people walking around. And it is simply a drawing studio. It was the first drawing studio that was commissioned by an art school for about 90 years. And it has, the traditional north light and then a bouncing clerestory light at the back that brings more light to the back of the room. And it's simply a large room in which you make drawings. And it's, after all, where I learned to draw myself. So there's a certain sort of historical interest. And sometimes the isolated object is suggested, this is for Saudi Arabia, and it is actually a house where the nose end of the house is the living part. And as you move to the open part, it's a combination of a sort of viewing area and a kind of stage set. It's a series of tableaus and electronic devices so that the real landscape can be mixed with this kind of contained artificial garden, so to speak. It has not been built. Another proposition is for a house in the flatlands of Norfolk, where suddenly there's an outcrop. And I borrow from using glass, but using the same technique that was used in that area for combining flintstones, making a slightly irregular system of compounding, and then wrapping it in a borrowed piece of hedgerow. A strange beastie in a flat, endless landscape, with perhaps in the distance a brother object. Or another development of the capsule into kind of almost a shanty, almost an American woodsy shanty. The mannerism of these things is one thing, but the instinct is another. And there's the play pavilion again, with its concealment, just hints of what is within. And then toy-like, we had to use Lego, a lot of Lego, because it was paid for by Lego. And 50,000 people used this pavilion, most of them kids, and there were constant queues of people wanting to play Lego. And I say it's for sale. And then this was a proposition linking in my mind that this pavilion might well have been the child of a much earlier scheme called the Instant City with the balloons, which dropped a series of little pavilions down. It's a sort of looking back over the years to the earlier dream, and then one eventually gets to make one. And there it is on the last night before it was deconstructed, sitting in Kensington Gardens amongst the trees as this slightly, what's the word? Coy, perhaps, object. Nooks and reveals and swirls. It's always interested me. This is now really a formalist point about these conditions. The swirling the form. The blue building on the left, I hope, will be built. It's a commission from United States, and it is for the back end of Los Angeles, the Mount Washington area. And then a cafe that we did, which again uses swirls, and a project for a visitor center, which again is using swirls. And there are more swirls. And I just stopped to think of conversations I've had sometimes with Tom Main, and another project on the left that I did for Berlin of a marketplace, which is surrounded by swirling ramps. And conversation I've had with Tom Main about, I think he's a brilliant maker of gyratory systems. And he and I have often talked about Stirling, James Stirling, who was the king of gyratory systems. If you see his scribbles that he did, particularly as the tutorial scribbles that he made for his students in Cologne, in Dusseldorf, they're full of tricks of swirls, and all the projects that he did for the museums, of which the Stuttgart Museum is the only one that got built, all involve these gyratory systems. And I have a fascination for these sorts of swirls. Or nooks, and we were able, in another building I did for the Bournemouth campus, which is very highly colored, but much cheaper than the other one, has these particular nooks. And in our Australian architecture school on the right, there is these big nooks. And in various projects, I keep using the idea of nooks and reveals, or nookie, what I call nookie orifices, mostly exhibition pieces of exhibitions. And on the right, a kiosk that we did in Taipei once, all to do with peering inside these strange shapes. And here, the bottom left one is where there are people eating. We make this strange shape where we can eavesdrop on them through a funny nook, through a funny orifice, or great nooks, so that on the scale of the projects for Neon, the nook might be, 5 stories high. And in the Australian building, the Bond, it's the Architecture School for Bond University. One does these cuts and swirls and nooks on fairly large scale, and then on one of the facades on small scale, where we're dealing with the north, which is of course the hot sun-giving side, and one's tailoring these nooks over various minor rooms such as toilets and storerooms and so on. Or in a tower, fairly recent project, competition project for a tower in Tirana, the nooks inserted actually contain public activities. So you bring the public activities out of the town into the what is otherwise a housing and office building. In the law building in Vienna, which we built from competition some while ago, it's 2 buildings. The bigger one is the law faculty. The smaller one is the what do you call it? The office, the administration building for the university, and the nooks are internal nooks as well. These dark blue areas on the right are in fact meeting places in amongst all the tutorial rooms. And the building, as you move around the building, you don't move in this sort of rectangular way. You glide around the edges of the building. You glide through the gap between the 2 buildings. I'm very into curves and glides. Similarly, in Australia, in Bond University, you glide around the building as well as peer through the nooks inside the building. I deliberately use the word insidious, this notion of something not just being there, but kind of playing with your degree of discrimination and your experience. This is a piece of 18th century gardening in Schwetzingen, in the middle of near Mannheim, in Germany, and the end of it is a painting, which is lit by a sort of an architectural device that brings a lot of bright light to it. And leading up to it is this weaving of both iron, timber, and vegetation. And it's kind of got this sickly sweet way of drawing you in. And you kind of, half of you say, oh, this is bullshit stuff. And the other half of you is saying, wow, this is a wonderful atmosphere. And I'm talking about atmospheres, after all, in a way. And so in projects such as this, which was a project made around the 2000, bit before 2000, I take a proposition of a house that gradually has the vegetation moving in on it and overtaking it. This is one of six drawings. Yeah, and this is a later version of it, or at least a later stage in the process. Or in a visit to Rice University for a short while, I did my own take on Rice. I watched from the hotel 7th floor how so much of Houston is tree covered with two-story buildings sitting under the cover of the trees. And in my proposition for a guided car system extension of Houston, I worked over the same idea of using the trees as part of the composition. Or even in detail, a project where one is using this layering of vegetation and streams of riddled facade where the water would start to engage. Actually, it's a borrowing of a Marcel Breuer idea in Rotterdam, done in probably the 1950s, I think, in the Biankov store. Or here, a very complex drawing that took a long time, where I set up a quasi-landscape and I invent the vegetation. I then implant some very obvious tectonic elements. But more importantly, there are some places where you start to think that the arrangement of the vegetation has certain architectural overtones. Or is it that the architecture has vegetational overtones? And I mix and match. I have some things where it's definitely an insertion, an implantation. Others where there's a nuance. Others where you think it's just vegetation. Then you start looking, maybe, what is that creeping out of it? And I play with myself. I play with the game of what is defined as one thing and what is defined as another thing. And in the Los Angeles project, we have such a this extraordinarily steep side. I can't walk up it remotely. And so we bring the platform out from the top of the site where you park the car anyhow. And then one has this deck platform, and then you drop the vegetation below. You play the reverse game from what you normally do. Interestingly, if this all gets built, there's going to be my one, a Tom Main house next to it, and a house by the owner who's a partner of Tom Main on the other side, and he lives in a crappy old house at the top left-hand corner. And here the business is bringing the hillside into park, bringing the park into garden, the garden into the town, and then bringing it even over to the roofs and pieces of some of the buildings. There's no dividing line between the wide open space, the tailored park, the reserved patch of grass, and actually pieces of the building itself. And here is another tie. This tie you will meet in a minute. This is an earlier tie. Each was done for a birthday, by the way, organized by my wife. And this is me standing with a jacket. I just thought you'd be amused by this. This is in Seoul, Korea, where I had a small exhibit, and the shirt is the biggest exhibit really in the show. Sometimes there are hybrids of the vegetated condition, which are surfaces that are partly mechanized and then adjoining surfaces which have growies on them. Now, here's a provocative one, I hope. Is color analogous to chatter? And is architects' avoidance of color a form of arrogance? An induced seriousness by the dour, the silent types who go for black or white or gray or worst of all, biscuit? Are they just squeamish? When I was very young, when I was a second-year student, and I started this game when I was 16, so I was only 17 at that time, I was fascinated by Brazil. Again, like Argentina, it was like going to Brazil would be like going to the moon. I did eventually get to Brazil, and I did eventually meet Niemeyer and Burle Marx. Burle Marx is the one that really interested me, the landscape guy, who was originally a painter. And there was a famous, I just introduced here, for those, and with a few people in the room who might know this name, Carmen Miranda, who was a Portuguese lady pretending to be Brazilian and always wearing fruity things on her head. And she was archetypical of the, and there's in fact a Carmen Miranda museum in Rio. And I was fascinated by Brasiliana, and I've been a few times, and so I did nobody asked me to, but I couldn't resist doing a tower that I felt was in the manner of Brazil. What's happening here? I've got a funny box on there. What is that? How do I get rid of that? Okay, thank you. And of course, color, we have the issue of color in clothing. Why not? And we have here a proposition where the building itself sits under a large kind of Bucky dome, as in his proposition for Manhattan in what the fort is. And the building therefore can be much more flimsy and can be much more decorative and much more colored. It's really like a giant interior exhibit, except it is a composite building. And this, which is the cover of my upcoming book, which will be out in March, and is the Hall of Columns. The Hall of Columns, where there are some floating capsules if you look hard, and there's some entrails, and people are running around doing their business. It could well be a railway station. But there's an imposition of a kind of alien architecture, rather like that you get when something's being repaired and they come in with a sort of temporary thing. And I'm saying there's a game being played between this alien architecture. I'm deliberately making it mysterious. What goes on in that dropping ramp? There's even some vegetation sort of trying to get in on the act as well. Or here where the primary building of the project, and this was a master plan for a place near Madrid, where the core of the master plan was to be a golf course. And the golf club itself would be the most prominent building, a simple shape in bright red. And this was the child of Graz. I think Graz was already built by the time I did this drawing. So I was saying, no, this is a cousin of Graz, but it happens to be red and it happens to be a golf club. And sometimes one has been able to do some small-scale constructions that follow on from this. A corner of our Vienna building is what I call the sunshine corner, because the configuration of the plan necessitated indentations in order to light the very many, it's a large building, the many tutorial rooms. And then having done that, and also used a color palette where we went from dark red to orange to yellow, and eventually a creamy white. So as you got nearer the sky, you had this whiteness. As you got nearer the ground, you had this darkness, but a color. And I've used the same color palette in the building I call Bournemouth 2. And I'm afraid, and basically, because one's from the seaside. And I said, you know, I know Vienna extremely well, and it's full of white and grey buildings and cream buildings, and it gets incredibly cold in the winter. I mean, really windy and cold and bitter, and it's white and grey. No, there's some colour. And the people, particularly the ladies who work sort of looking after the building and the staff in there, they congratulated us several times because they said, you have given us a jolly building. We love working in it. And so this is Bournemouth 2, the cheaper building, again, using maximum color, including the pavements outside, also colored, and all the furniture and fittings and everything. This is, again, this is a recent exhibit in Taipei on the right-hand side where we have incorporated some of the pieces of drawings as a three-dimensional kind of theater set. And this is the color inside the play pavilion during a lecture event. And people queuing up to go into it. I think these were not the kiddies. I think this was a special evening when people had to be signed in. And a more typical day when people are just playing Lego. And the towers, we put 3 towers inside, rather like obelisks that were never totally seen from the outside. You had to come in, and then you were allowed to attach your own Lego constructions to those as well. So when it was finally, it was, coming to closing at the end of the period of 3 months, it was full of incrustations, not just done by the architect, but done by all the people that had come there. And there it is, ready for a lecture. We did have an Archigram evening at the pavilion where we were selling copies of Archigram 10. And there I think you can still buy this Lego version of the pavilion, which doesn't quite get it right, but it's a good try. And to just show the thing of color, now you've seen this drawing before, but you saw the cool version before. And this is the hot version. I'm fascinated because I couldn't resist doing two versions. And I have them at the moment in the studio, hanging up one next to the other, still trying to make up my mind. What is it color, or is it talking about atmosphere as well? I'll tell you in 6 months' time what I really think. And also the guys, this is part of a film where they digitalized the red drawing, the one with the big red sky and the small scale megastructure, where you walk through it. And of course, sometimes in the interpretation, the detail gets a bit off key, but it is fundamentally based upon that drawing. And since we're playing with more of these things, I don't know quite where that will lead. I think it's important that I still keep doing the basic drawings, that it works that way, rather than me looking at the film then saying, what should I draw? I think that would be very dangerous. No, it goes this way. Sorry, I'm very naive with this machine. And so in the process of designing the Tirana Tower, one was testing the palette and interested in the sort of coloration that would be appropriate to that city and not any other city. And sometimes color, and there's the tower, again, the Tirana Tower as a model, where the majority of it is a sort of pale blue color. On the other hand, a building that I built but didn't have a lot of control of because of the finances at the time, it should have been really blue, this building, and it isn't. It's a sort of gray, pale blue. The kiosks at the bottom should be really detailed and brightly colored, but they didn't really have money to do them, so they just stuck up a few colored walls and hoped for the best. It was a real tester because the design was quite complex with colored shutters and things on the roof, and these kiosks were very important. The idea of the mass sitting above the activity of the kiosks, but they didn't have the money. There are 100 families living in there quite happily, and the bathrooms are in the right place, and etc. But there's a certain point at which it's a question for the person, if you ever get to build, at what point do you lose the plot but still build a building? Or at what point are the essentials of the building, the essentials in a sort of moralistic sense, are all there? The bathrooms in the right place, the windows do what they're meant to do, the staircases are so interesting and work. 100 cars are parked underneath somehow. But these extras would have made it a joy. And they are never there, so that the agreeableness of the house plan and the correctness of the piping and so on is there. It's okay, it works. But it would have been a joy if you'd had those shutters and the roof garden and the kiosks working and the right color of blue. And here's another thing, drawing the analogy between chatter and the fruity city. I don't mind the chatter. I'm conscious of it. I'm conscious of variety. Sameness it's variety. You know, the individual all has a head and usually hair at the top of it, but then the interest starts. This is just to prove I can do white. This is the interior of the blue drawing building, the studio building. Just to and it's expensive to do it's expensive to do a very blue building that is very white inside. You have to have very careful detailing. You can't do it on the cheap very easily. Is architecture to do with order? The odd thing in the odd place intrigues me. This is our old gatehouse somewhere in Suffolk. And I'm fascinated by strange things in strange places. In our Australian building, we designed also the furniture so that the students could make the configuration. They're designed in such a way that they come in and they organize it into different organizations into a large space. And people enjoy the building. I have a photograph of this man on the right-hand side, clearly very toothy Australian gentleman, clearly enjoying the building very much, or perhaps the glass of champagne that was in his hand, I don't know. And here I'm interested in an old story, which is what do you do with backyard industry? How do you make a structure of a backyard industry? This is a special kind of mini megastructure with these kind of industries taking part in small platforms with very high degree of servicing. Here I'm interested in housing people. That at the moment we have a problem of extending our towns and villages in the UK. And what's going to happen is that a lot of quite charming villages have this awful piece of sort of suburbia tacked on to the side of them. And there are many examples as you come to a rather agreeable place and then suddenly there's a rubbish stuff tacked on the side, tending to be village. My suggestion is to put them in towers in the middle of the forests. And my historical antecedent is in the eastern part of England, which was very rich in the 17th, 18th century, and therefore was able to build these exquisite churches that popped up out of the forest. And if you can pop a church out of the forest exquisitely, you can pop housing out of the forest exquisitely. And this is the tie. This is the project of which the tie. This is a cave, a mechanized cave, looking out past the water onto a landscape with additional mechanized caves in it. It brings together probably several of the themes I've been hinting at. And here, the house itself is in a strange position. And then I was very aware, I mean, it's an absolute challenge to do a house in Los Angeles because I know Los Angeles extremely well and have been a sort of student of looking at the Los Angelino house, which I think, you know, the 20th century house, every conceivable mannerism of the house has been done in Los Angeles. And the heroes are heavily in my mind. And there's Pierre Koenig's extraordinary house jutting out of the hill, or the things by Lautner, and many, many other examples I could have shown. And I'm aware that's sitting in my head, and it can be sort of devastating because you think all the heroes have done everything you possibly can with precipitous cliffs. And here, strange objects in strange places. We're back with the capsule again, which is reincarnated as a paper capsule, as a vegetated capsule, the megastructure again, but losing things rather more loosely into space, which you could probably never afford, or placing them in the rocky part of the desert, or placing them at the edges of forests. I'm interested in other people's architecture. I'm interested in certain examples which are naughty but nice. Just this is really a sort of byway. Fujimori's houses up on sticks, or Zvi Hecker's apartment building at the back of Tel Aviv, or the bizarre tower in Lucca, which suddenly sprouts into being trees. You see where I borrow my ideas from. And I like silly things. These are a couple of sillies. And this is a bit of an anecdote here. I was in Valparaiso, Chile, as one is, and I was taking a photograph of a kiosk because I collect kiosks. That's something I won't bore you with this evening, but I collect pictures of kiosks. And I was photographing this kiosk, and the old bloke in there brought a dog up and sat the dog in the kiosk. And I immediately mailed a photo of this to my friend Tom Hennigan in Tokyo, an English professor in Tokyo, very known guy. Don't ask me why it was him. I did. He immediately emailed back a better dog in a better kiosk. This is the Japanese dog. And there's another story which I won't go into, which is about animals on the head. There's a professor at the Bartlett, very known guy now, but when he was my student, he stuck toy animals on his head. I was in Los Angeles early one morning, and I saw a guy with a toy animal on his head. I immediately buzzed, which we can do now, with the laptop. Yeah, I buzzed this to the guy in London, and he immediately buzzed me another photograph of an animal on somebody's head. This is a subculture with which we known academics indulge upon. But I also like little funny things that you see, and then Tokyo is my favorite place for this. Look at this. We come out of the hotel, one which we've stayed in several times, and across the street, you just see a nondescript building with a funny window. And then you look at the window, and it says husband wife darts club. Not man and wife, not husband and wife, but husband wife. No, husband wife. Dart club. Only it's half a dart board, of course. I love things like that. It's still there. It was still there the last time we saw it. I shouldn't make fun of other cultures. They're making fun of our culture, which is playing darts, which apparently is getting bigger and bigger. But I love things like that. They're sort of meaningless, as is the dog in the kiosk. But are they? And so, and then here's another couple of things. There's a very, very boring English seaside town called Weston-super-Mare. It is, I don't recommend you bother with it. Don't ever go there. But it has this absurd thing, this spike in the middle. Now, I haven't done any research on this. I have no idea who did it or why. But they did it. Somebody did it. Somebody went to Weston-super-Mare, which is about the most dull place you can think, except got some sea. And there's this thing. So you're walking down a street in Santiago, Chile, which is a nice enough town, you know. And in a very intense part of the city, there's a hairy house. Why not? But there are not very many hairy houses anywhere. I love this stuff. I can't get it out of my system. And here's the thing about doors. The one on the left is probably my favorite. I think it's a very sexy entrance. The entrance with that tongue hanging out. Done by a very good Art Nouveau architect, Rosen, whose work is worth, he's not so famous, but he was a very good architect. And it has this tongue. Why not? And then in Melbourne, Australia, by the beach, there's a very self-conscious mouth out of which you can see me walking. Why not? This trigger is so strange. Oh, I've done that thing again too. Sorry. Oh, I'm back in the world of the living, yes. Oh, wow. Oh, why didn't you give me this earlier? It's a dream. It's a dream. It goes forward and it goes backwards. I think skins are very intriguing, odd skins and clothing. In Graz, Colin and I were allowed to do one piece of the skin, which was investigated. Oh, now it's gone on the blink as well. There we are. We were allowed to do one piece where we did this sort of melting orifice. It's neither window nor is it wall. And then the city got worried because they said, don't bugger around, spending extra money. We wanted to get on with it and finish the job. So that was the only place in the building which was meant to be more of those conditions. In this drawing, I'm investigating running from solid through faceted, from faceted to movable, faceted to growy. In this drawing, one's talking about, again, semi-translucent skins that then start to fly. In this condition, one's talking about a foreground or an enclosure, which is quasi-vegetated and quite complex, almost Victorian in mannerism, through which you see the normal city of high-rises with curtain walling, such as you get here. And this is the last section. In the act of escaping, how much architecture are we willing to drag behind us? We don't necessarily have the wherewithal of the mad king of Bavaria, as in the picture, but we do have notions of escape, but combining infiltration with the escape. In this dramatic landscape, some of the side of the cliff has to be looked at, not just the outcrops, which are obviously constructed objects, buildings, but some of the surface, particularly that on the middle right, which is actually window, suggesting that the cliff itself is an enclosure. I'm interested in caves, so to speak, as enclosures, and mixing constructed surfaces, i.e. architecture, with the natural condition. And here, the same proposition, but where the built parts are extruded from the landscape, are aggressively appearing out of it. Or here, where there's a variety of landscape conditions, some of them dramatic, into which inserted building form can be found. So finally, the piquances of slither, of undulation, of mesh, and of smile remain with me, particularly that of smile. Yeah, why not?
Let's first of all thank you, Peter, one more time for a brilliant talk. So, questions from the audience? Yes.
Good evening, sirs. I'm really impressed by your very beautiful hand drawings. So would you please introduce us some ways of you to doing the creative imaginations? Since we can see a lot of elements in your hand drawings, so how could you just imagine those things? Thank you.
I think rather simply, I think again, I reiterate the fact that when I was doing the Archigram stuff, people said, yeah, how is it going to happen? You know, and then, you know, some bits of it did happen. And I reiterate the same thing. I mean, some of it is difficult. Some of it requires fairly complex things to be made or sourced. But we now have apparatus by which you can make a very wide variety of objects without them being standardized. You know, that things no longer have to be standardized. They can be bespoke because of the computational process that can make them bespoke very quickly. But I don't know whether your question is something more than that. I mean, the transference of things from a hand drawing to a three-dimensional condition is now possible because one has people at one's elbow who can turn them into 3D, and then sometimes they don't work or they need massaging. But in my mind, I reiterate the question that really does interest me is to what extent some of the nuances are lost. I think there's a very interesting sort of anecdote that was years and years ago when Zaha started her office. There was an old Apple Mac computer, and the storyline is probably an urban myth, was that this computer didn't completely work correctly, but was very useful in Zaha's office because she could do things that weren't really correct. And then they sorted the computer out, and of course it would only do what is could only proceed in its normal procedure. And something was lost because in the hand drawing, of course, you know, the drawings by Escher are the obvious famous case where it's not actually possible, but you can still draw it. And there is a sort of waywardness, and those drawings that I do in recent times, I have an idea in my head, and I usually have some sort of framework, and I usually base them upon some sort of geometric, there is usually an organization, either in my head or actually drawn or on a plan or something. And then I improvise. Quite frankly, a lot of it is improvisatory. In fact, it gets very boring if you don't improvise. Just ends up looking like you thought it would do. Sometimes it ends up worse, of course. That's the known. But so then the question is, if you can draw anything, can you then backtrack and construct anything from that anything drawing? And I think there is also another funny thing, though, that and I haven't done that many buildings. I've probably done about 9, I think, max. But when you start building, you take account of things that you never thought you would. You become very conscious of the small object. At the first 1 or 2 things I built, suddenly aware of radiators. That you placed a radiator and it sort of screwed the whole thing up, or the degree of shadow from a beam was much more than you expected it to be, or the effect of height. And then you gradually get into it. The scale I never had any problem with. I've never had any, always things seem to turn out the size I thought they would, but the shadow condition was an interesting one. And it's then a question of feedback that when you do start building, there literally some quotes of things that you've made that come back even into the looniest of buildings, that I can point to different things. If we had a great deal of time, I could take a couple of drawings, say, that came from that, and that came from that, and I've seen a thing like this, and I've seen drapes that do this sort of thing. Maybe not exactly hanging that way, maybe they're hanging this way, but they have that characteristic. And I'm not sure this raises, and I'm making a very long-winded answer to your question, but it leads then to the issue of detail. I'm not sure that I'm a scrupulous detailer. I admire scrupulous detail, but I think some buildings are over-detailed. I think, for example, if I take a case in point, I think some of the Foster buildings are over-detailed. I think there's just, you know, and I can remember my friends who were working on the Sainsbury Centre all those years ago screaming, "We've got the longest neoprene gasket in the world." I thought, fuck that. Okay, very nice. Thank you very much. It's like somebody makes, the pancake with the least eggs in the world, or one of those things, And I think there are all sorts of funny things. I mean, I was being a bit naughty, mimicking I apologize to any Japanese or sitting here one of my things I'm not allowed to do now is my well-known imitation of Japanese speaking English, which used to be a party trick, but I'm afraid I'm not allowed to. But I'm amused by how things are sort of, it's not poking fun, it's just, even why would you have a darts club there? Who the hell plays darts? Whether you're married or not, is another thing. And why do you show half of the dartboard? Because you have to look at it about 6 times to know what it is. Whereas you have the whole dartboard. Oh, that's a dartboard. You could have, if I redesigned that, I'd have a bloody great dart and a man and a lady throwing it. Job done. But no, it's the way that things are distilled. And I think, going back to the point, we distill too. When we're designing, we're distilling things. We're quoting what we want to quote and not quoting what we don't know how to quote. And back to your point, these drawings, one is always arrogant enough to think that one is somewhere around the way stretching the vocabulary. I think if I was asked, what do you really think that you do or have done, I would say my main interest has been in stretching the vocabulary, not changing the whole raison d'etre of architecture, not necessarily changing the total mannerisms, although I'm very interested in plan form. I mean, I sometimes give lectures on comparative plan form, but not this evening, thank you. But the pushing and pulling of the vocabulary. And I think when you look out of the window, even here in Hong Kong, which is not the world's most boring city, but there's so much, here we go again. Glass, gasket, no gasket, mullion, no mullion, thinner mullion, tricky mullion, no mullion, mixture of mullion and gasket, tick, 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 tick. Panel, strip between panel, wide strip between panel, narrow strip between panel, concealed strip between panel, no strip, 2 strips. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. One wants to, that's why I showed the other people's Looney Tunes thing, including the one in Looker, which God knows probably wasn't intended or was intended or maybe intended. Who wants to put a tree on the top of a building? I do. But those guys, maybe the tree just started and they couldn't stop it. And then they quite liked it. And then it became a symbol of the town, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but it's many years, a famous critic who I knew very well, I was starting to do lectures and I reported him. I said, the great thing about questions, I realized they're not a pain in the ass. They're actually very useful because then you give an additional lecture. He said, join the club. Sorry. So another question from which I can give a further extended lecture would be useful.
He asked a question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Did he? You're Mr. General Questioner.
Yeah, I asked one, but then
You better be very good then if it's the
Yeah.
second one in a row.
I have but then it's about the inspirations I got from this lecture.
That's
Well,
nice. Thank you very much.
yeah, thank you. So what I gathered from this lecture is you have a lot of little tweaks you like piquancies or nooks or little details, a little like weirdness of life. And I actually want to ask like this in relation to your education, because I imagine your education being a very big departure from
Very much.
a very different from these like piquancies or because I imagine your education being very modernist, rational planning and all that, the modernist.
Do you mean architecture education or pre-architecture education?
I think both actually, because
Okay, I'll try and because it's complex. I'm son of an army officer, and I moved to many towns, all of them in England. then when we didn't need to, my mother, who was a neurotic, enjoyed moving, and we continued to move several times. I went to about 10 or 12 schools, everything from a minor public school to a very bad grammar school to vegetarian, I'm not a vegetarian, but a vegetarian progressive school, to a straight up and down grammar school, to a good grammar school, to a private school where there were a few boys and lots of girls. You name it, I've been there. In architecture, I went to the local art school, which wasn't a university at that time. It was just an ordinary art school. And I went at the age of 16, having only done O levels. I went straight into architecture. I did 3 years there and then 2 years in an office. And then I went to the A, which was the fancy posh school to which you could still go on government money at that time, which I did. And then I came out, I immediately started doing competitions, and the second one I think I did, I won it. And that was useful. And I used that to get brought on crits at the AA. And after doing 2 years of that, they took me on the faculty because I got fired from the office for being in the A too often, etc. Now, what of that is education? I lived in different parts of England. I acquired local accents from time to time. So at the end, I don't know what my accent is. I think it's just what used to be called standard English. I can imitate a few things, not only Japanese people, but West Country people and Scots. If doing drunk Glaswegians is difficult, but possible. These are layers, and some of the architectural education, I was very lucky. Probably one of my best teachers was a guy who was the 4th year master at the AA, but then came back to Bournemouth, having won a competition, and was implanted into our tiny Beaux-Arts school. We was the last place where you had to draw all the orders in axonometric. You had to measure churches with pieces of lead and then trace them. We had books of Victorian ornament that we had to trace from, etc. It was really old school when no other school in England was doing that stuff. Whether it was useful or not, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. All these things are layers. There is a story, and it is published in a book, that my dad, whose job in the Second World War, having been a soldier in the First World War successfully with lots of medals, he was called a quartering commandant, and he would commission things for housing, gliders and troops and stuff. And he went, I still just remember one afternoon, and I was sort of tiny tot taken with him, and we saw a field with a slope in it. And he said, yeah, that'll do. It'll drain down to the bottom. He was a soldier, but he knew these things. And about a month or two later, I went back, and it was full of what? It was a camp for Italian prisoners. And it had watchtowers and walls and huts and things. I thought, that's a nice game. That's a nice thing to do. My dad has made a town. And that is supposed, the mythology has grown around this memory, that was a sort of making towns is fun. I then got very interested in town planning, and I realized by the time that in architecture school that town planning had become sort of socioeconomic planning basically, and that didn't interest me at all. That's a very long-winded answer to the question. Thank you for asking it.
Can I add a bit to your long answer? My father, not my father, I'm sorry. My brother worked on a military farm in Inner Mongolia. And every morning they would start by making a toilet. So there is someone more senior would draw the plan directly on the ground. And then they would just build it, run the earth. The reason they need to go back to build another one, because the one they built yesterday collapsed. So they start all over again to build it. So I just couldn't help to think about that story. So yes, please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. We are in the heritage conservation business. If you were to save one of your buildings as a monument, meaning they can't change anything, which one would you pick?
I would probably pick the Blue Studio. Now, my wife and I probably disagree on this because she very much likes the Vienna Law Faculty building. But the Blue Studio is totally me. I mean, one works with colleagues and so on, and it's got a piquancy because that is the institute, not in the same site. They built a new campus out of town, but it's where I did learn to draw, institutionally. And it is about drawing, but it's also about, you see, having gone all around the house about this sort of complexity and plurality of form and objects and multicolor. I'm choosing a building which is in a way the most disciplined, which is only white and is only blue and has a single form of construction, which is pre-built in a German U-boat factory by shipbuilders, transported in pieces, re-erected, spot welded, and then the interior surface is the same plasterwork that Zaha used in Oxford, which is this very expensive technique of a fiberglass impregnated plaster, which you computer plan and they stick it up. And then you actually having after all that, two guys are up on the trestle for about 2 weeks, sort of refining it. But I love it. I love going in there. It has a particular acoustic, which when I do sort of mouth music, it's very effective. I suppose that's my knee-jerk reaction. I suppose I should say Graz, because it's a building which has affected the city and has become it's been used by Austria, advertising Austria on posters and things like that. So I suppose it's important, quote unquote, and is the most published, etc. But the other one has a certain sweet quality. It's a pocket Graz in a way. It is a sort of child of Graz in certain respects. That's, yeah. That doesn't need a long answer, that one.
More questions? Oh, okay, here.
One of my favorite teacher is Michael Webb. I studied with him with 3 semesters, not because I chose him, but we had not much choice.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
And I did remember something that he mentioned when they work together, the Archigram, they're imagining, they didn't use computer to make drawings, and they were trying to imagine what if a computer would draw. And they were accelerating this future, maybe this optimism of changes very unknown. And then a couple of years later, he described he was a little bit shocked with Columbia producing these paperless studio. He was imagining that that's not what I was expecting that computer could do, mainly because all the drawing became very real. It's not so much different from photograph. So when yesterday's lecture and today, you meant a couple heroes, Tom Main and also John Hiddink, and also probably really a couple of your mature drawings. And I noticed that both Tom Main's recent paintings and Hiddink's mature work, they were largely focusing on flatness. The drawings have become much more in the same level, not in the way that how the computer drawings would project, or what Michael Webb was describing, what the future would be different. Any reflections about this?
Yeah, quite interesting. Well, I'm sort of just thinking it through. I know that I have a tendency to be able to knock off what appears to be a complex drawing if it is on the flat, if it is an elevation. And even going way back to before, when I was first at the A and was hired back in the provincial office for holidays, because I was now a sort of star, and they paid me more. And I remember spending one Christmas holiday, because always running out of money. So I did 3 weeks of banging out elevation after elevation after elevation of a old people's home in Southampton. I can't remember which one they built. I just banged them out one after the other, and I was quite good at it. And I realized that some of the drawings I've shown you, and we'd have to go back through them, and some of the most successful ones, and I speak now as somebody who sells prints, so there's statistics and tax and stuff to pay, that they are elevations. Probably the most popular of mine is that one I said with the red background. That is an elevation. Now, it's been possible for somebody working for me to analyze it and then make a fly through by looking at it a long time and talking to me. Now the guys are taking another one, which is not an elevational drawing, and three-dimensionalizing it, and that has some plans attached, so that makes it easier. But the elevation is, yes, it's very easy to, I shouldn't say, very easy to do elevations. And you can build, while you don't have to bother with the three-dimensionality and looking around the side, and is that really round, and does it cast a shadow, You're simply just taking piece by piece by piece by piece. I think the part of your brain that is inventive, in a funny way, is released to be inventive rather than logging. Okay, you mustn't put things that necessarily bump into each other, and you have to deal with sort of implications of depth and implications of translucency or transparency. But the figure does a lot of the talking. As soon as you're concerned with moving around the side, it's the weight of the figure and, of course, its perspectival implications. Although I've always enjoyed making models, I've never had any problem. I mean, now, of course, the guys make the model in a box and it throws dust, and there it is. And the fun has gone out of it, actually. I love gluing things together. But I think it is something to do with that. It is at a moment in time during the process of drawing, being an inventive drawing, not a logging of something. The part of the brain that is interested in the value of the object rather than necessarily its three-dimensionality, though with experience you could generally explain how deep something would be and how heavy it might be in relation to other things, but you're able to concentrate on it. Nobody's ever asked me that question before, and it's a really, really good question, because you set me thinking now. You set me thinking, because some people have said, oh, some of your best drawings are the elevations, and left it at that.
Okay.
And it would be interesting because, Mike and I are very different, and he's an absolutely fantastic drawer. I mean, I'm a plodder by comparison, but he's a fantastic drawer. And he's painstaking in a way that I could never be. I could never be that concentrated. I'm too my mind is too busy. I'm too in a hurry to keep moving. And so, but it might be interesting that we both almost exactly the same age and have been confronted by people developing things on the computer. And then you say, oh. I remember, I have to continue this a bit. The first guys that started doing drawings on the computer at the A, which is where I was teaching at that time, were really usually very boring people who did crappy stuff, but they knew how to do the computer. And suddenly people were looking at them. Oh, Joe Bloggs, he's doing the computer. But actually it was banal. The really interesting people wouldn't go near it. Then what happened by the time I got to the Bartlett particularly was that the really interesting people were playing tricks with you, and they're still doing it. A lot of it's hand-drawn, but some of it's computerized, looking like hand-drawn, hand-drawing, looking like computer. And they'd say, okay, which bit was done by the computer then? And you can't tell because it's all part of a process. And there's one teacher there who was a student of ours, a lady called Laura Allen, who's quite brilliant. And she's now a professor, and she has been talking about this for some time because she's very good at this. She's a brilliant designer and drawer, but she uses the computer and then doesn't. And she will tell you, she will sit with you and tell you which bits of her drawing are this and that and how it's been mixed. And that's the point. It doesn't really matter. You know, Ron Heron used to say, oh, X draws with his foot. That was the ultimate put down. He said somebody draws with their foot, meaning their drawing was banal. It wasn't necessarily hairy, etc. etc. We could go on all night on this one.
Okay, one more question. Is there anyone with hands? Oh, here.
Oh,
In the second row.
Thank you for the lecture. May I know, having raised a musician, and it's almost like we hear music when we see your work. What has music informed you in your work? And if so, what kind of music do you listen to?
I don't was informed me. I don't play any instrument because our son is a music person. I have listened mostly to classical music. When I came to, when I was in the art college, they were playing sort of New Orleans jazz, which never appealed to me. Warren Chalk and his circle were into modern jazz, that's to say, you know, Miles Davis and thereabouts. And I have got into that to some extent. When we were a sort of Archigram group, we occasionally went to pop concerts together. All 3 or 4 of us would go. And mostly you went to hear American groups, I have to say. I didn't ever particularly like the Rolling Stones. I did go to a Beatles concert. It was in Bournemouth, of all places. It was so loud that you couldn't, the shrieking was so loud, you couldn't really hear them, but you knew all the records anyhow. And there was a support group, which were totally unknown at that time, called the Kinks. And I remember saying to my then wife, I said, those guys are good. The leader, at least you could hear them. And said, those guys are good. And immediately, you know, 3 weeks later, they were famous. So I suppose I have some sort of ear for talent or not, or maybe, but I continued largely to listen to classical music. And through my wife sitting in the front here, was drawn more and more to chamber music, which I was mostly a late romantic symphonic, Bruckner, Mahler, Sibelius in particular, that kind of stuff. And I still listen to, I can make up Sibelius in the bath if you want me to. It's probably still my number one favorite. And Yael doesn't really like Sibelius very much. So we have and our son was brought up listening to that and went to music school where he had to do it. Computer and music was a new course, but he still had to write string quartets and learn, you know, that as well. So I don't know. There's quite a long. Both my wife and I were exposed as children to a lot of classical music.
Great. Thank you so much. And let's conclude the evening.